Darren Kavanagh and Jamie Bell weren't just names on the streets of Liverpool. They were the architects of a ruthless empire that controlled the city's darkest corners. From small-time hustlers to feared gangland kings, their rise would ignite a violent turf war, spark mysterious disappearances, and shatter the fragile peace of a city on the edge. This is the story of power, betrayal, and the brutal cost of ambition in the underworld known as the Street Kings. In the late 1990s, Liverpool was a city standing at a crossroads. Once a proud port town, its economy had been hollowed out by decades of industrial decline. Factories were boarded up, jobs were scarce, and hope felt like a distant memory for many. On the streets of Toxteth, one of Liverpool's most deprived areas, a new generation was coming of age. One raised in the shadow of broken promises and crumbling council estates. Among them were a group of young men who saw the chaos not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. They started small. Car thefts, burglaries, and petty drug deals gave them their first taste of money and influence. What set them apart wasn't just their ambition, but their discipline. While most crews were sloppy and driven by impulse, this group operated with precision. They called themselves the Street Kings, a name that began as a joke among friends, but soon became a brand feared throughout Merseyside. Unlike other gangs, they didn't just fight for turf. They planned, strategized, and treated crime like a business. They used burner phones, encrypted pagers, and avoided flashy displays of wealth. To outsiders, they were ghosts. Their leader, Darren Kavanagh, had once trained to be a boxer, and he brought that same focused intensity into the gang's operations. He believed in structure, loyalty, and silence. Every member had a role: lookouts, runners, dealers, cleaners. They ran the streets with military precision, and within just 2 years they had taken over most of the small-time drug trade in South Liverpool. Heroin, cocaine, and ecstasy moved through the estates like water, and the Street Kings made sure they got a cut of everything. But they didn't stop there. Darren had bigger plans. He forged alliances with older criminals, used cash to bribe local officials, and started importing drugs directly from overseas. The Street Kings weren't just another gang anymore. They were turning into an empire. The police knew something was happening, but they didn't know who was behind it. By the time they noticed, it was already too late. In a city filled with desperation, the Street Kings had found power. They weren't just surviving in Liverpool, they were taking it for themselves. And as their influence spread, it was clear they were only just getting started. Loyalty was the lifeblood of the Street Kings. Without it, nothing worked. From the very beginning, Darren Kavanagh made it clear, betrayal wouldn't be forgiven. The gang wasn't built on friendship alone. It was built on fear, trust, and a strict code that everyone followed. If you were in, you were family. If you stepped out of line, you were gone. The crew grew fast, but not recklessly. Every new member was either someone Darren had known for years or had been carefully vetted. Many of them were boys he grew up with. Kids from the same blocks, the same schools, the same struggles. Others were relatives or trusted allies from smaller crews. Everyone had to prove themselves, usually through a combination of violence, silence, and results. Once someone was in, their loyalty was tested constantly. It wasn't enough to keep quiet, you had to be useful. Whether it was moving product, collecting debts, or intimidating rivals, everyone had a job. Over time, Darren expanded the network beyond the streets. He brought in corrupt prison officers, customs agents, even a few low-level cops. These insiders provided information, protection, and sometimes cleared the way for shipments to pass through unnoticed. It wasn't just a gang anymore. It was a system, one that worked like a machine with Darren at the center, pulling the strings. But with every new addition, the risk of exposure grew. To protect the crew, Darren introduced strict protocols. No personal phones. No meetings in the same place twice. Surveillance was always assumed, and plans were shared only on a need-to-know basis. Even close friends weren't told everything. It created a culture of paranoia, but it also kept the operation tight. As their power increased, the street kings became known for their brutal enforcement. Anyone who owed them, crossed them, or threatened their business paid a heavy price. Houses were firebombed. Debtors were beaten in broad daylight. Rumors circulated of bodies buried in the woods or dumped in the river. The violence wasn't random. It was calculated, designed to send a message. Inside the gang, there was a strange sense of pride. They believed they were smarter than the rest, more disciplined, more professional. In their eyes, they weren't thugs. They were businessmen, soldiers, kings of the streets. But the higher they climbed, the more enemies they made. And while loyalty had kept them together, it would soon be tested in ways they never saw coming. The Liverpool docks had always been valuable. But by the early 2000s, they became the most important piece in the city's criminal puzzle. Whoever controlled the docks controlled the flow of drugs, weapons, and cash into the northwest. For years, smaller gangs fought over access, each trying to bribe port workers or slip shipments past customs. But the street kings wanted more than access. They wanted total control. That meant pushing out every other crew, no matter the cost. Their biggest obstacle was a rival gang from Bootle, known as the Craymen. Older, more established, and with deep connections in the shipping industry, the Craymen had long dominated the northern ports. They saw the street kings as nothing more than cocky upstarts. But by 2003, the kings had grown too powerful to ignore. Tensions simmered for months. Then everything erupted over a single missing shipment. A container of high-grade Colombian cocaine, worth nearly £3 million on the street, vanished before it could be delivered. The street kings blamed the Craymen, certain they had hijacked the load to cripple their operations. The Craymen denied it, claiming it was stolen by customs or possibly lost in transit. Neither side believed the other, and both prepared for war. What followed was a wave of violence that tore through Liverpool. Shootings, drive-bys, and firebombings became routine. Families unrelated to the feud were caught in the crossfire. Businesses were torched for having the wrong customers. Schools went into lockdown. In some areas, even the police stopped patrolling after dark. The city hadn't seen gang violence like this in decades, and it was all happening in plain sight. The Craymen underestimated how far the street kings were willing to go. Darren Kavanagh launched a series of coordinated attacks, targeting warehouses, stash houses, and anyone known to associate with the rival crew. 2 brothers connected to the Craymen were found beaten and dumped on the steps of a hospital. A nightclub known to be a Craymen hangout was firebombed during a private party. The message was clear: Liverpool belonged to the street kings now. Despite the chaos, neither gang was willing to back down. The war dragged on for months, leaving bodies in the streets and fear in every corner of the city. But behind the violence, something more dangerous was happening. The street kings were becoming addicted to power, and with every battle they won, they moved one step closer to thinking they were untouchable. Between 2003 and 2006, a strange pattern began to emerge in Liverpool's underworld. Men were vanishing, not killed in gang shootouts or left in alleyways, but simply disappearing without a trace. These weren't random people, they were connected, associates of the street kings, middle-tier dealers, suspected informants, even a few rivals from the Craymen who had survived the turf war. In total, 8 men went missing in just under 3 years. No bodies were found, no witnesses came forward, and no one was ever arrested. The disappearances weren't officially linked at first. The police had little to go on. No crime scenes, no forensic evidence, just cold silence from the communities affected. Families pleaded for answers, but few dared to speak openly. In Liverpool's inner circles, it became common knowledge. These men had crossed the street kings in some way, and this was the price. Some were suspected of skimming profits. Others had talked too much or gone behind Darren Kavanagh's back. One had allegedly tried to defect to a rival crew. Whatever their reasons, the outcome was the same. They were erased. Rumors began to swirl about what really happened to them. Some said the victims were buried in remote farmland outside the city. Others believed they were dumped into the Mersey, weighed down so they'd never resurface. One whispered theory suggested there was a disused slaughterhouse on the outskirts of town that had been repurposed as a killing site, cleaned so thoroughly no trace was ever left behind. None of it could be proven, but everyone agreed on one thing: these weren't spontaneous killings, they were calculated, organized and meant to send a message. The effect on the streets was immediate. Fear took over. People who once bragged about knowing the gang now avoided even saying their names. Loyalty to the street kings tightened like a noose. No one wanted to be next. Darren didn't need to shout or threaten. His silence carried more weight than any weapon. By making people disappear without evidence, he had created a new kind of control. One built not on violence alone, but on the idea that nothing and no one was safe if you crossed him. But power gained through fear always comes with a cost. And while Darren saw the disappearances as a show of strength, he didn't know that one of them would become his empire's greatest weakness. Jamie Bell was one of the original street kings, quiet, loyal and smart. Unlike most of the crew, Jamie wasn't drawn to the violence or the lifestyle. He was a numbers man, the kind who could turn stacks of dirty cash into clean investments without leaving a paper trail. Darren Kavanagh trusted him with everything. Jamie handled the books, managed safe houses, and moved money through shell companies across Europe. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. To the outside world, Jamie didn't even look like a gangster. He wore suits, drove a modest car, and kept his head down. But inside the gang, he held the keys to the entire operation. In 2007, Jamie disappeared. There was no warning, no known conflict. One day he was at a meeting in Spic. The next he was gone. At first the gang assumed he was laying low or on a quiet job abroad. But days turned into weeks, and still no one heard from him. Then a rumor started to spread that Jamie had been thinking about leaving, that he'd grown tired of the violence and was planning to run, maybe even cooperate with the police. The idea sent shockwaves through the crew. If Jamie had flipped, the entire operation could be exposed. He knew too much. Names, routes, accounts, everything. Darren ordered a silent hunt. No noise, no panic, just quiet pressure applied across the city. But Jamie had left behind nothing. It was as if he'd vanished off the face of the Kier. A month later, an anonymous tip led police to an old warehouse on the edge of the docks. Inside, hidden beneath floorboards, they found a ledger, handwritten, coded, and meticulously kept. The writing matched Jamie Bell's. It listed dates, shipments, aliases, and cash amounts. But more importantly, it contained clues, enough for investigators to piece together parts of the Street King's international operation: offshore accounts, property bought in false names, port workers on the payroll. It was the first real crack in an empire that had seemed untouchable. No one ever found Jamie's body. Whether he fled or was silenced by his own crew remains unknown. But his disappearance, and the ledger he left behind, marked a turning point. The police now had a trail, and the Street Kings, for the first time, were exposed to something they couldn't control: evidence. After Jamie Bell's disappearance and the discovery of his ledger, the Street Kings tightened their grip on Liverpool. Darren Kavanagh knew the police were circling, but instead of retreating, he doubled down. He wanted to end any remaining threats, once and for all. His focus turned to the Craymen, what was left of them. By 2008, the Craymen were fractured and desperate. Years of war had left them without leadership, and many of their top men were either dead, in hiding, or behind bars. But a handful still held power, mostly in Bootle and Kirkdale, clinging to the last corners of the drug trade. Darren saw this as unfinished business. He wanted to wipe them out completely and take absolute control of the city's underworld. In early spring, the violence escalated again, but this time, it wasn't messy. It was surgical. Over the course of a single weekend, 5 key Craymen associates were killed in separate targeted hits. A known enforcer was shot twice in the back while walking his dog. A dealer was gunned down at traffic lights. Another was found in a burnt-out van on the outskirts of the city. The attacks were fast, professional, and left no witnesses. Within days, the Kremen's entire leadership had been dismantled. Then came the most shocking incident of all. A high-end nightclub in the city center, popular with both Kremen loyalists and regular partygoers, was hit with a petrol bomb during a private birthday party. The fire spread rapidly, injuring several people and sending a message no one could ignore. No one was safe, not even in public. The city was thrown into panic. Media coverage exploded. Politicians called for emergency measures. But Darren didn't care. For him, this was about legacy. The Kremen had once laughed at the street kings. Now they were gone. Darren stood unchallenged at the top. With their last rivals destroyed, the street kings reached their peak. Their network stretched from Liverpool to Spain, Holland, and even parts of the Middle East. Drugs flowed in through the docks. Laundered money moved through fake businesses, and silence was bought with fear. But something had changed. The violence was no longer just business, it was personal. Darren had become obsessed with power, and that obsession made him reckless. While he celebrated his victories, he didn't notice what was happening behind the scenes. Enemies weren't the only danger now. The real threat was coming from within. While the streets of Liverpool were consumed by gang violence and fear, a quiet battle was being waged elsewhere, in the world of finance and paperwork. Maya Ellis was a young financial analyst working for a small but dedicated unit within the city's council. Her job was to track suspicious financial activity linked to crime, money laundering, and corruption. At first, Maya's work seemed routine, but as she dug deeper into a cluster of shell companies and offshore accounts, she uncovered something far bigger than anyone expected. What caught Maya's attention was a series of unusual property purchases in Merseyside. Small businesses, warehouses, and even residential homes were being bought through complicated networks involving companies registered in Dubai and Malta, locations notorious for lax financial oversight. The scale was enormous, but the transactions looked clean on paper. However, Maya noticed inconsistencies, payments arriving just before drug busts, unusually high cash flows for businesses that barely operated, and transfers between accounts that didn't add up. Her instincts told her this was more than coincidence. Maya carefully traced the money trails, following hundreds of transactions, coded messages, and bank transfers. What emerged was a web connecting Liverpool's criminal underworld to international money laundering operations. Her findings suggested that the street kings were not only trafficking drugs but were also funneling their profits through complex financial channels to hide their true wealth. Despite the dangers, Maya took her evidence to local authorities. She knew the risk of confronting one of the most feared gangs in Liverpool, but she also knew that without this information, the gang's empire might never fall. Her report became the foundation for a secret, multi-agency investigation involving the police, customs officials, and international financial watchdogs. Over the following months, undercover officers monitored transactions, intercepted shipments, and slowly built a case. The street-level violence distracted many from the financial war being waged behind the scenes. But Maya's work was pivotal. Without her uncovering the money trail, the authorities would have been left chasing shadows. Her discovery marked a turning point. The street kings were no longer untouchable street criminals. They were part of a sophisticated global operation. The net was tightening, and for the first time, it seemed like the gang's reign might be ending. Not with gunfire, but with paperwork. By 2010, the pressure on the street kings was reaching a breaking point. Years of violence, disappearances, and secretive dealings had made them feared and untouchable, or so they thought. But behind the scenes, the gang was cracking. The police task force, armed with the financial evidence uncovered by Maya Ellis and the insider information from former members, was closing in fast. The biggest blow came from within. Two key members of the gang, once trusted lieutenants, decided to cooperate with the authorities. One was Darren Kavanagh's own cousin, a man who had grown tired of the endless bloodshed and wanted out. The other was a mid-level dealer who had been arrested on unrelated charges, and saw turning informant as his only chance to avoid a long prison sentence. Their testimonies were devastating. They revealed details about drug shipments, hidden stashes, secret meetings, and, most damningly, the list of those responsible for the disappearances and murders that had haunted Liverpool for years. They described how the street kings had corrupted port workers, bribed officials, and laundered money through offshore accounts. The police wasted no time. Coordinated raids were launched simultaneously across Liverpool, Bootle, and even abroad in Spain. Dozens of safe houses were stormed, guns, drugs, cash, and incriminating documents were seized. Several key players were arrested, many caught trying to flee the country. Among those arrested was Darren himself. He was found on a luxury yacht off the coast of Marbella, trying to escape the net closing in around him. His capture was a major victory for law enforcement, but also marked the beginning of the end for the street kings. The arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal world. The gang's carefully constructed empire was crumbling from within. Fear turned into panic, loyalty eroded as more members sought deals to avoid long sentences. The once impenetrable network was now riddled with holes. But the real surprise was how quickly the gang unraveled once the first domino fell. What had seemed like an unshakable power structure was exposed as fragile, held together by fear and secrecy. Now, with the authorities closing in on every front, the street kings faced their greatest test. Not from rival gangs or street battles, but from the law. Their rise had been violent and swift, but their ruin was about to be total. The trial that followed the downfall of the street kings became known across Liverpool as the trial of the century. It was the largest organized crime case the city had ever seen, involving dozens of defendants, hundreds of witnesses, and mountains of evidence. The courtroom was packed every day, as the public and media clamored to hear the details of the gang's inner workings, details that had once been carefully hidden beneath layers of fear and silence. The prosecution presented a clear, brutal picture of the gang's reign: murder, drug trafficking, arms smuggling, money laundering, and intimidation, on a scale that shocked even seasoned investigators. Thanks to the testimonies of former insiders, the informants who had risked everything to speak out, and the meticulous financial trail uncovered by Ellis, the case was airtight. Recorded conversations, intercepted messages, surveillance footage, and secret ledgers painted a damning portrait of the gang's operations. Darren Kavanagh was the star of the trial, not in a way he would have wanted. His role as the kingpin was laid bare, showing not just his involvement in criminal acts, but his cold, calculating leadership style. The evidence showed how he ordered hits, controlled drug routes, and silenced anyone who opposed him. The disappearance of men linked to the gang was discussed in detail, revealing the brutal methods used to enforce loyalty and eliminate threats. The jury faced weeks of testimony, many parts so graphic and chilling, they left the courtroom in stunned silence. Survivors of attacks, family members of victims, and former gang members described the terror the street kings had brought to their lives. The trial was more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning for a city long haunted by violence. Ultimately, the verdict was unanimous. Darren Kavanagh was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Many of his closest lieutenants received similarly harsh sentences. The judge called the gang's activities a dark chapter in Liverpool's history, praising the courage of those who helped bring the criminals to justice. For Liverpool, the trial marked a turning point. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about reclaiming a city's streets from the grip of fear. Though the scars remained, hope began to return. The reign of the street kings was over, and with it the shadow they had cast across the city. After the trial, Liverpool entered a new era. The fall of the street kings left a power vacuum that no one could easily fill. Smaller gangs scrambled to claim pieces of the territory, but none had the reach or discipline of Darren Kavanagh's empire. The city's authorities, buoyed by the successful prosecution, launched renewed efforts to clean up neighborhoods long dominated by fear and crime. Community programs flourished, aiming to give young people alternatives to gang life. Former gang members, some released early on good behavior, joined outreach initiatives, sharing their stories as warnings to others. Schools in once troubled areas reported fewer incidents of violence, and local businesses slowly returned to streets where customers had long been scared to go. The docks, once the gang stronghold, became the focus of increased security and surveillance, cutting off the flow of illegal goods that had fueled the gangs. But the legacy of the street kings lingered. The violence and corruption had left deep wounds, and for many families, the loss was still raw. The disappearances and murders haunted conversations and anniversaries, a reminder of what had been sacrificed. Some feared that parts of the old gang culture still survived underground, scattered in smaller crews or hidden in new networks. Darren Kavanagh remained behind bars, isolated from the world he once ruled. His life sentence ensured he would never walk free, but stories of his influence and ruthless control continued to circulate. Some believed he still pulled strings from prison, while others said the gang had fractured too much to recover. Meanwhile, the city of Liverpool worked to rebuild its reputation. Documentaries, books, and films began exploring the rise and fall of the street kings, turning the dark history into lessons for the future. Police departments improved their strategies, using intelligence-led approaches to prevent such empires from rising again. The financial trails uncovered by Ellis and others became blueprints for cracking down organized crime. Money flows nationwide. The story of the street kings is a warning about the cost of power built on fear and violence. It shows how crime can grow when communities are left vulnerable, but also how courage, persistence, and teamwork can bring even the most dangerous criminals to justice. Liverpool streets may never be